The lawyers representing the plaintiffs brought in this expert. So you would assume they're bringing in an expert who is going to say, yeah, this is a disaster, residents are sick, we don't even know how many chemicals. But the expert they brought in, who previously consulted or worked for Chevron, Dow Chemical, Exxon, and Enbridge. Go Google those companies. So I want to play this clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to play this clip of what, and this was recent, this was like a week ago, of the lawyers that are supposed to be representing these folks are bringing in this expert to basically say everything's fine. Let's play that clip.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick.
Yep.
We'd like to share a quick video from an experienced doctor who has followed the derailment and has generously offered his expertise. He is not involved in the litigation, and this is a completely independent third party.
I'm a medical doctor and a PhD environmental toxicologist. Based on my best judgment, there will not be any long-term health impact of chemical exposure from the derailment to community members of East Palestine. But as far as people just living in East Palestine or working there or in nearby neighboring communities, we don't expect there to be any long-term health effects associated with chemical exposure resulting from the derailment. The amount of contamination that would be associated with measurable health effects would depend on the individual chemicals and to some extent on the characteristics of the exposure. But I can tell you that the chemical contaminations that have been clearly associated with health effects in communities have been hundreds of times greater than the measured levels that we are now finding in East Palestine. From the derailment, the number of chemicals that have been produced and that may remain in very low levels in the East Palestine area are dwarfed by the amount of other substances that are there that have been put there over years of just normal human activity. Some of the chemicals that were released are known to be associated with cancer. In particular, vinyl chloride, which was the cause of the Venton burn, is known to be a human carcinogen, especially for the liver. The levels that people were exposed to in the community were so small that we don't expect any kinds of cancers or other health effects to have resulted from those. Well, because there were some small levels of chemicals that were evolved, not zero, the risk due to those chemical exposures is not zero either, but it's very small. It's much, much smaller than 1%.
Before we get to the residents, I want to bring in a different toxicologist. This is not Stephen Petty, but I want to bring in, his name is George Thompson. He has 55 years of experience as a toxicologist with chemical and hazard assessments. He's worked in government, he's worked in the private sector, schools, you name it. And he has objected to this settlement, the $600 million settlement, and more importantly, through his analysis. This guy was retired, by the way. He came out of retirement because he is so alarmed and so concerned with the nothing to see here, everything's fine narrative coming from the EPA. He came out of retirement and he has evaluated the East Palestine and Pennsylvania situation, and we're going to bring him in. George, You are a toxicologist with 55 years of experience. So can you share what your findings have been? Because your findings are this is much more extensive than East Palestine and Western Pennsylvania.
When I first saw this event on television, I was very intrigued because of the magnitude of the plume and the duration that it lasted, 5 or 6 days. And I was impressed with it from a toxicology viewpoint. But when the EPA and the Ohio EPA came out within 6 to 8 or 10 days and said everything's safe, I knew that that wasn't true. There was too much that I had seen just on television with no data to know that that couldn't have been safe in that short a period of time. So, as already stated, I decided to come out of retirement and devote myself to evaluating this to see what the truth was. The first thing I did was go on the internet and download the manifest for this train that was on Norfolk Southern's website. And that manifest identified 52 cars that were involved in the derailment, and it also identified the contents of each car and what its condition was at that very preliminary time. Now, this is within probably 2 weeks of the start of the derailment. And it would tell which ones burned. And then they used a strange term that to this day, I don't know exactly what it means, but they had another group of cars that were designated as impinged. And I assumed that that meant impinged by fire. And so I had a car-by-car analysis of the contents, what was in them. And I went on the internet and did research then as to what were the hazards of the contents. And of the 52 cars in their manifest, 8 different products, there were 26 different products in the 52 cars. There were 8 products in the cars that were carcinogens, could cause cancer. The only one that I've really heard talked about is vinyl chloride, but there were 7 others. In addition to that, I then researched and said, what happens when you burn the contents in these cars? And frankly, I was a bit stunned because I'd never looked at combustion chemistry and toxicology before this incident. But what I found is that when I looked across all of the cars that were either burned or impinged, that instead of 8 chemicals that could cause cancer, I identified 119 chemicals that can cause cancer. And those cancers occurred in 21 different body and organ systems. So there's lots of types of cancer that could come from this incident. I also calculated how much was involved, and I looked up rail car content, and most of the rail cars carry around 200,000 pounds of material. Some of them are 180,000, some of them are 220,000. But when you multiply that across the cars that were involved in both the burning and impingement, there were over 5 million pounds of materials in cars that Norfolk Southern said burned. There was another 3 million pounds in the cars that they said were impinged. So there was a total of over 8.5 million pounds of chemicals that were spilled, dislodged, and combusted there in East Palestine. The toxicity of those chemicals, hundreds of chemicals now that were released, the toxicity would have been simultaneous. You wouldn't just have been inhaling vinyl chloride, and so then you know that you got to worry about lung cancer. You wouldn't have been inhaling benzene, so you know about blood cancer. You would have been inhaling these vapors and chemical particles all at one time. And they would come into your body, and I haven't totaled up the number or I've forgotten it, but there are a lot of those chemicals that are calculated, that I calculated what are the combustion products that produce dioxins. It's not just one source. As mentioned here, it isn't just dioxins from vinyl chloride being burned. That's true. But there are dozens and dozens of other chemicals that were burned that produce dioxins. So you would expect that in testing the materials there, the water and soil, the air, that you would find evidence of dioxins. And I was dumbfounded to hear in the early days that that wasn't true. Now we know that that is true. I've actually seen analyses done by Scott Smith that maybe some of you know, where he was given garlic raised in a garden, I think in East Palestine, and the same garden had produced garlic the year before, long before the derailment. And we found very high levels, he found very high levels of dioxins in that garlic. So if the people had eaten the garlic, let alone inhaled the dioxins, but if they'd eaten the garlic, they would have ingested dioxins, and once dioxins are in your body, they stay for a long time, measured in years. They're stored in the fat in your body, and the breadth and depth of their toxicity, they are one of the most toxic chemicals known. And as mentioned, it's what made Agent Orange work in Vietnam. But they last a long time in our bodies and in the environment. So it's not going to go away quickly. Now, the interesting part is that when I heard Dr. Carson's video, until just mentioned here that I heard for the first time, I had overlooked the fact that he was your expert. I thought he was Norfolk Southern's expert because everything he said protected Norfolk Southern. And in my complaint to the court about their agreement, I went question by question. He had 10 questions that I responded to in detail in my submission to the court, where he only stated opinions, generalized, generic opinions that didn't have any data or justification for his opinion. Like he said at one point that he thought that the risk of cancer from this experience was less than 1%. I can't imagine how a statistician could say less than 1% when you had literally 8.5 million pounds of chemicals put up into the air that included 120 chemicals that cause cancer. It's got to be more than 1%. The other thing that I am concerned about is you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the plume cloud that went up. I've only seen it on TV and pictures of it, but it was massive, and it went on for days. And one of the interesting features is that when this accident occurred, there was what's called a temperature inversion. So that plume cloud didn't go up thousands and thousands of feet into the air. It went up to 3,000 feet, is what I've heard reported, and plateaued off. It didn't go higher than that. It spread out like a pancake. And I've actually seen pictures taken from airliners of that pancake. It's huge. I don't know what dimensions it covered from that picture, but it went up in the air and just sat. And the carbon particles that make that black cloud in the plume have the hazardous chemicals bonded to the particles. So that if any of those carbon particles that settle out anywhere, anytime, are going to have those chemicals still bound to them, whether it's on water or the soil or our bodies. And so that dispersion of that cloud will determine to a large extent how massive this incident was. I call it an apocalypse because in my 55 years of toxicology, watching incidents like this around the world over the half a century, I have never seen an incident as dangerous and as hazardous as this incident in East Palestine. It's the worst I've ever seen in 55 years. I then went into the literature and found a publication by another scientist, group of scientists, that used the NOAA air dispersion model to determine what happened to the plume in East Palestine. Now, you probably all know that the settlement agreement goes out as far as 20 miles. Well, when I saw that plume, and particularly the pictures that showed it plateaued at 3,000 feet and how massive it was, I couldn't imagine why the settlement agreement only went to 20 miles. Where did they come up with that number? Well, this air dispersion model that I found only a few weeks ago, published for East Palestine, showed that the plume cloud was not just dispersed in one area or one direction. It was dynamic and would change from day to day and hours per day. But it did transverse up into southern Canada, went all the way up to Lake Huron and across to Lake Ontario. It encompassed much of New York State, including all the way to Vermont and New Hampshire. It hit the northern tip of New Jersey, where I live, covered all the state of Pennsylvania, and then there were southern portions of it, southeastern portions, that went down through West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. In my calculations, that covered approximately 126,000 square miles. And your proposed agreement is for 20 miles in radius around ground zero. Doesn't account for any of the others. And in my research of this air dispersion, I came across a statement from a family in Ontario, Canada. They live just near Niagara Falls. The same week that you folks were suffering through the fires in East Palestine, this family in Ontario had the same symptoms that have been described in East Palestine. That's a lot more than 20 miles away. And so that the magnitude of concern that I have from a toxicology viewpoint is that this is absolutely unprecedented. The science of toxicology and medicine has no way to account for the hazards or risk associated with simultaneous exposure to hundreds of chemicals. It's never been researched. It's not in the medical literature. They don't know how to interpret it. So for Dr. Carson to say that into the future, he doesn't think there's going to be any impact. There isn't one piece of data anywhere in the world that can tell him that. And I've looked. And so this is unprecedented in the magnitude, the numbers of chemicals involved. It's unprecedented in the quantity, the 8.5 million pounds of chemicals involved. It's unprecedented in the number of different times you were exposed. There was a fire that started early in the week, I think on the 3rd or 4th of February, but then they ignited the vinyl chloride fire on the 6th of February. 2 different times you had fires. And then they did the remediation to clean out the tracks and take all the dirt and stuff out so they can get the railroad running again. And that put dust in the air all over again. And that was all contaminated dust. And if there was no contamination as claimed by the railroad, they can't find out.
Hey, George, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Two questions. I just want to make sure, because they're going, so the EPA and Norfolk Southern will try to discredit you. You've been used as an expert in about 50 to 60 cases before?
Yeah, in my retirement, I I was actually doing it before I retired, but I retired to becoming an expert witness. And I think the number of cases I've been involved with is up to 56 now. And in some of those expert witness cases, I have been given the opportunity to evaluate other experts on the other side, the opposing experts. In two of the cases, I was able to criticize those experts to the point that the judge concurred that they weren't experts. And that would certainly be my interpretation of Dr. Carson. This man was not an expert. And the cases that I've been involved with are all kinds of chemical hazard cases. And I've represented both defendants and plaintiffs in the cases. And I've based it always my opinions on what the science told me. Did you have another question, Jordan?
Yes, and the 120 potential cancerous chemicals, would you presume that the EPA is not testing for most of those chemicals?
Well, the answer is yes. I would assume when they tell us that they didn't find dioxins, and I knew there were tons of dioxins put in the air, that either they weren't looking or they weren't looking in the right way or the right places. And I know that in the beginning, when they quickly came out, think back to the very first week when they announced within 8 days or whatever it was that everything was safe, the air was safe, the water was safe, no soil contamination. When they answered that quickly, they had to be talking about air and volatile chemicals that would have dissipated. What they never said is how they did the test, when they did the test, or where they did the test. They just said generically, it's safe. Don't worry about it. And part of my concern here for the people in the immediate area, but I also don't know that it's not the same thing for the people in Canada that were exposed, is that after 9/11, we all knew about 9/11's disaster with the terrorists, predominantly because of the 3,000 people that died on that day. But what we don't hear much about is that since then, 4,300 people have died and 71,000 people have suffered diseases from their exposures on 9/11. I have a tremendous concern that's going to unravel for this case. The people that are exposed, nobody died on February 3rd. And so it's easy to say, okay, there's no problem here because nobody died. But since then, this spring, I've heard about a fellow in I think it's East Palestine, who came down with breast cancer, a man who came down with breast cancer. And just about a month ago, within the last month, I've had a friend of mine who lives in East Palestine tell me that he has 2 brain tumors. Now, some of the chemicals that I've identified in my research are called cancer promoters. In other words, they don't cause cancer themselves, but they change body cells' reaction to other chemicals that promote the creation of cancer. And so with these 2 rapid cases of cancer in the first 15 months or so, it's not a surprise to me, because we have 120 chemicals that I know of that cause cancer, and we have other chemicals that promote cancer. So for some of those to both be in the same person at the same time,
and George,
it's not a surprise.
That gentleman you mentioned that has cancer is actually here.
I haven't met him, but I've talked to him.
I wanted to ask you, obviously you're not a doctor, but he came down with the cancer 18 weeks after this chemical explosion. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not a surprise. If you go back and study the literature with 9/11, many of the cancers, we normally think that cancer takes 10 or 20 years to form. But that isn't the case after 9/11 either. They had different kinds of cancers, some of which came on very quickly in weeks. And they had others that took months, and then still others that took years. But we have chemicals here, what I call a chemical stew, that we don't even know what's going to happen, because think of it as this way. I've identified hundreds of chemicals that were in that stew. But what I can't find any data on is when you have that many chemicals in a very hot plume, what reactions do they have? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that there's any research on it. So there could be other chemicals formed that were not formed from the starting materials in the railroad cars. It's very complicated.
Now I'm going to just pass the microphone to a resident.
Okay.
Who has a question for you?
Hi, George. We've spoke before. Now, my name's Ashley McCollum. Most of you know me. Now, we did have a waste analysis from the site early on that was conducted by Norfolk Southern, and the lab was Eurofins, and it was early February 2023. And out of the 5,000 pages of chemicals that they had found, there were dioxins, but they regret to inform anyone that there were dioxins found. And that did come out on the 1 year, which 5,000 chemicals is a lot. And most people don't understand, I think we did speak about this, when these chemicals go up into the air, do they stay in the air for a longer duration of time?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is no. The chemicals go up in the air in that plume because they're hot. So hot stuff rises. It rose with the hot air. But in the process of mixing in that plume, in the fire and the plume, the chemicals themselves bind to the carbon particles, what's called soot or ash. That's the blackness of the plume. But think of each of those little microscopic carbon particles as a sponge. It's going to absorb chemicals. And as they're hot, they're going to rise. But when they cool, they're going to start falling out of the sky. And that's why this study of what is the air dispersion is so critical, because it says they could have been distributed over very large areas.
Okay, and now we also, you and I and a couple other people went over some test results that were conducted in some homes. And you did tell me about mine and the presence of vinyl chloride. It was at a 1.8 interior at parts per million, and my exterior was 1.0 parts per million. Is that high in your opinion?
Of course it is. And in the context, you see, I assume that the interior, you're living there. You might have moved, I've forgotten actually whether you did or you didn't, but anybody that goes in that house then is exposed to vinyl chloride. And that's a carcinogen, among other things. It affects a lot of other organs. It isn't just a carcinogen. It's also it's very toxic. But yes, those are levels that you don't want to be exposed to.
Thank you, George.
I have some more residents that want to pick your brain, so hold on one second.
Yeah, this is Kevin Detmer. I lived at 626 East Taggart Street. I'm within a rock throw of the derailment. Our house was tested, but it was tested by the people that were contracted by Norfolk Southern. Okay, I have recently not had my house tested for dioxins, but I had it tested. They took two-sided tape and they pulled it from my counters, from my ceiling fans, and they said that my house, the only thing that they could find is soot and like from the control burn, if you want to call it a controlled burn. But what I want to know is what is in that soot.
That would have to be analyzed separately. In other words, it isn't, I mean, the fact that they found the soot, and we know historically, it's known in the scientific literature, that soot in a fire has the chemicals bonded to it. As I just explained, it's like a sponge. And so those soot particles need to be analyzed to see what chemicals have bonded to them. But that's the transport mechanism for the toxic chemicals in this whole process, is those attached to the soot.
Okay, so my other question would be, is when they were doing this testing, what if they didn't test for the right chemicals or the right dioxins?
If you don't test for it, you won't find it. And that's the problem, I think, with some of that early testing, is that they had a small select group of chemicals they were testing for, and therefore they come out and report that they didn't find any of the really bad stuff.
And George, would you find it problematic that Norfolk Southern, that the EPA initially had Norfolk Southern conducting the testing in the homes of the gentleman that just asked you that question? Norfolk Southern is the one that detonated the chemicals. Should their data be trusted?
It'd be very suspect. And one of the difficulties that I have is that from the reports I've read about, is that some of the methods used were not appropriate methods. I've already talked about the soil, where they mix 6 inches of soil when it's only the surface you want to really look at initially, where it would be most concentrated. And that ends up diluting the soil contamination levels. But it's the same thing with the air. If they come into somebody's home and they do air testing, you need to run the air samples appropriately. And some of these, I think, I've read that they use badges, when in fact, proper air circulation tests would mean that you have a vacuum, a pump, if you will, that sucks air through a tube that binds with the hazardous chemicals. I didn't hear of those methods, but if I were looking at this from the case in a lawsuit, which this is, I mean, that's what we're talking about here with the settlement agreement, I would have wanted to look at the methodology. And I think that some of those early methods were what I would call in the trade quick and dirty, and they were designed to show that there weren't chemicals there, as opposed to bending over backwards to see truly if there were chemicals. And Jordan, one thing I'll say to you that I haven't said before to you, Jordan, is that I initially reached out to the law firms involved in the lawsuits on behalf of the plaintiffs to be their expert witness, because I've done so much of that. And I never heard back from any of the law firms soliciting my input, even though I already put my own time of hundreds of hours into the analysis. They wanted to go a different direction, and particularly the ones that handled the lawsuit, I was simply told they want to go a different direction. Conversely, people here, some of you are from Darlington. I don't know if you know, but your Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania has submitted comments to the court saying that this settlement agreement is not adequate. So your Attorney General in Pennsylvania has filed against this this settlement agreement. I don't know what the status is in Ohio.
And did you happen to have spoken with Michael O'Shea? He was one of the plaintiff attorneys?
No. No, I didn't talk to anyone.
I have another question from a resident. This is the wife of Wayne. Wayne, unfortunately, is the gentleman who came down with the double breast cancer, but his wife has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, George. My question for you is, knowing what was in the plume, as you have explained to us, what are the probabilities that there could be absorption in your home if you have blown-in insulation in your walls?
I think that to interpret that question a little bit, I think you're asking, could your insulation have absorbed some of the chemicals? And the answer is yes. I've done probably 20 plus lawsuits for spray foam insulation. And one of the things that is commonly determined is that when you spray that in, it's like styrofoam. It goes in as a liquid and then dries like styrofoam. And it's known that it absorbs chemicals. And so I think the answer to your question is that the chemicals that are dispersed are very reactive. And so they could attach to many surfaces. And one of the concerns I had in 2023 is that people would find this dust in their homes and vacuum it out. And I was telling as many people as I could, do not vacuum it, because that's just going to go straight through your vacuum cleaner and back into the air, and you're going to be exposed again.
Hold on one second, George.
Yep.
Okay, George, in our house, we live in an old house built in 1915. And prior to purchasing our home, they had the very old like the shredded paper type of insulation blown into our house. So that's my question is, would that like newspaper type shredded insulation that they blew in, would it absorb those chemicals as that plume went over?
Highly likely, if the air in your house can get to that insulation. In other words, is it open or covered? If it's covered with fiberboard or paneling of some type, then that will reduce the likelihood. But that type of paper insulation would be very would tend to absorb readily moisture.
And George, with the disclaimer that you're obviously not a medical doctor, so you're not making any diagnoses, but I have, just within the last few hours, interviewed residents who have completely lost their hair. A 35-year-old woman has completely lost her hair. I have interviewed an 18-year-old girl who is having seizures. She was healthy before the derailment and detonation. I have interviewed people who are urinating blood, passing blood through their stools. I've spoken with people who have had strokes. I mean, the list goes on. Memory loss. I interviewed a 55-year-old woman today who now has dementia. And all of these symptoms developed after this detonation, and they were pretty much healthy before this. Obviously, you can't, you're not a doctor, but the 120 cancerous chemicals that you're saying could have been a product of this, are some of the things I just described potentially connected with those chemicals?
Okay, let me back up. Let's forget about the 120 chemicals that cause cancer for now. And let's talk about the other 100 or 200 that have other toxicities, other toxicologic effects in the body. Some of those, for example, all of you probably have experienced the irritation effects. Some of that irritation could be through your noses, in your eyes, through breathing it into your lungs. You've experienced that kind of irritation. That family in Canada by Niagara Falls had those symptoms. Those kinds of chemicals also are irritating to the skin. So the skin, eye, nose, throat is common for irritants that those tissues are exposed to. That can lead to so the skin effect can account for the alopecia. The other chemicals that are released, non-cancer effects, affect the brain. I've talked to a number of people myself that have memory loss. I've heard about these strokes, and so there are classes of chemicals in that stew that was released that affect your brain. There are 20 different organs that are affected by the toxicology from the different chemicals released in that stew. And that's going to be unique to each person. Where is your body weak from a chemical resistance basis? And that can vary from person to person. But there are not any of the symptoms that you described here. The bloody urine, that's indicative of kidney problems. There are dozens of chemicals released in that stew that cause kidney problems, that cause liver problems. Almost all of the major body organ systems are affected by those chemicals. It isn't just cancer.
And I also want to ask you, when the media has reported about this, or the politicians have reported about this, they really focused on vinyl chloride. But I'd like to ask you, because you've called this unprecedented, and unless I'm misunderstanding, it seems what's unprecedented about this is people are not just being exposed to one chemical, but a cacophony of chemicals. So there is not many similar situations that you can compare it to where people are being exposed to this many chemicals, which can produce so many different symptoms.
That's absolutely correct. And the only precedent that I know of for this kind of exposure are the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the soldiers might have been camped downwind, and that stuff's burning all the time, and there are multiple chemicals released. But in this particular case, the uniqueness to me is the quantity involved. When I calculated, we're talking 8.5 million pounds that was in those train cars, and there wasn't much left after the fires were all put out. So most of that 8.5 million pounds went in the air, and it didn't go in as the products there. It went in as combustion products. And those combustion products, those chemicals from that combustion, are different than were in the rail cars. So let me give you one example. I think it was 4 of the rail cars were filled with plastic pellets. Now, the plastic pellets in the rail cars are innocuous. You can handle them with your hands. You can shovel them. They're not going to cause any hazardous response. There's no risk to it. But when you burn those, they produce dioxins and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. That's another forever chemical. It produces the soot and the ash that binds all of the different chemicals. There is a group of chemicals called radicals. These are highly reactive that will immediately bind to the soot and ash. It produces aldehydes, all kinds of hazardous chemicals when you burn those plastic pellets. And so the magnitude of the magnification of the risk is unbelievable when they lit the fire. What a bad decision that was. It was a terrible decision. And as the NTSB has said, that wasn't necessary. It was based upon misinformation or incomplete information. We wouldn't have near the problem that I'm concerned about if they hadn't lit that fire.
And George, I just want to read to you something that the so-called expert that is a Chevron, Exxon, and Enbridge and Dow Chemical former employee, that the attorneys for the residents, for whatever reason, use this expert. He said the farther from the derailment, the lower the concentrations were. At the time of the derailment, there was very low wind speed, and the plume of the materials from the derailment moved up high into the air before it contacted the community. The way that comes off to me is if it goes up high enough into the air, it just vanishes, the chemicals, and there's no threat to the humans below. Is there any scientific basis in what that expert said?
Well, he's ignoring the science, and he's ignoring the facts. The fact is that it went 3,000 feet in the air before the temperature inversion stopped it. So if you want to say 3,000 feet in the air is high, okay, I won't argue with that. It's not right on the ground. It's not surface. But what we also know is from the pictures is that cloud at 3,000 feet spread out, and it was flat on the top and it was flat on the bottom. And we know that because of the pictures taken from the airliners. What I can't tell from those pictures is how big an area that pancake spread out. But from the air dispersion models, I've already described the 126,000 square miles that it covered from the air dispersion modeling. And so the areas that were exposed could be far-reaching, and certainly we had one case reported hundreds of miles away at Niagara Falls. So for him to simply say, the further away you get, the less it is, that's normally true. But in this particular case, there was so much released, 8.5 million pounds, that you could be a lot further than 20 miles and not be safe.
I have another question from a resident here.
Hi, my name's Sharon Lynch. It's not really a question. It's just confirming what you both are saying. I'm 16 miles out. I'm on the Pennsylvania side going straight towards Pittsburgh, which I guarantee it made it to Pittsburgh because some of us are interested in weather and had wind map directions pulled up. And so I had gone outside my house. Why they didn't tell anybody to turn their HVAC off, I have no clue. But I knew to turn off my heater. I called my sister and a few relatives to turn theirs off. So I watched that weather inversion, and I watched the wind direction. So it's not just distance from, but it's direction also. And I've only seen that in one place. And when the wind was supposed to change, I went outside at midnight to check to see if the wind had pushed it the other direction yet, and it hadn't. So I got a lung full of chlorine-smelling chemicals. I guarantee you most people were in bed. Most people didn't turn their furnaces off either. So I had months worth of sore throat that, it wasn't strep, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. I went to the doctor 3 or 4 times. So I have record of all that, and I have record of a acne-like rash that went down my right arm. So they know that it went way further than 20 miles. And depending on direction from the derailment too, because it went right over me, all the way to Pittsburgh at least, I know. I went back out at 1 a.m. and it seemed to have cleared up, so I went to bed and turned my heat on. But I'm just confirming for you, yes, it does come down out of that cloud. That cloud was hanging over us with chlorine smelling, that's all. We know it went a lot further than they're admitting. That's all.
You see, one thing I would say to the group of you here is if you haven't already created a diary, do it now, even though it's a year and a half later. It's better than if it's 5 years later. But write down what you remember is the chronology and your responses. The event you just talked about right now, if you just recorded what you said and you had that in a written diary, you may want to pull that out 5 years from now and use that as documentation to get coverage for whatever mental or physical effects that you see unfolding in your life. But it's important to have that kind of information, and to have a good, thorough physical exam. I understand that one of the problems people have complained about in East Palestine is that the doctors won't give them routine urine tests and things. I've never heard of that before, but if nothing else, just to create a baseline so that if it deteriorates in the future, you've got the documentation that it wasn't always that way. But the challenge, I think, is that this isn't as though it's a one-time exposure. This went on for a week or more there, and I reiterate, then they dug up all the soil, putting dust in the air. Then they decided to blast the stream beds and put it in the air again. And I've tallied at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 incidences where these chemicals are put in the air.
Do you think based on the Plume direction, because your analysis has found that the plume of these chemicals travel to at least 8 states as well as southern Canada, from the way, I mean, that sounds to me, I'm not an expert, that it could become one of the biggest environmental disasters in American history. Do you agree with that? And if you agree with that, obviously this is speculation, but if this could be one of the biggest environmental disasters in American history, wouldn't it then also be true that this could be one of the biggest environmental cover-ups in American history?
Yes and yes. My biggest concern, my whole reason to come out of retirement, and the reason I put over 600 hours into this analysis, is that I am seriously concerned that this could be one of the biggest health and environmental disasters that's ever occurred anywhere, and that its effects are going to end up getting spread over the years. And I'm concerned we don't have any way of synthesizing that data. So when people start getting illnesses from all these chemical exposures 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, who's going to be keeping track of that data? I won't even be around then. So that's one of my concerns, is that we won't even learn from the experience. So I'm investing my time and attention now in trying to get people to look at this in a more flagrant mechanism so that they will appreciate it. And I'm most disappointed that in my experience, my scientific experience, this is the worst disaster I've ever seen. And yet you don't even read about it in the newspapers anymore. Nobody's concerned about it. Or if you get a headline, or Jordan, if your video here gets published, it'll make the news cycle and it'll be gone again. And that's not going to help anybody exposed anywhere. This needs to be carefully scrutinized by an independent group of scientists.
Quick questions before I let you go. Number one, based on everything we're talking about, shouldn't these residents in East Palestine, in western Pennsylvania, in the immediate zone, we could also talk about beyond 20 miles, but just in the immediate zone, shouldn't they be permanently relocated and bought out of their homes for those that want to leave based on the chemical threats, the symptoms already? Doesn't that just make common sense that they should be relocated and their homes should be bought out? Secondly, I mean, isn't it the government's responsibility to provide them free health care and ongoing medical testing?
Well, let me say that in March of 2023, so a month or two after this incident, I was saying publicly that they needed to abandon the town of East Palestine the same way they did the town of Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach, Missouri was bought out and abandoned 10 years after they knew there were dioxins there. So a lot of people got sick from that. But eventually they bought out and closed down the town. That was only dioxins. We're not talking about one chemical here. the way Times Beach was. We're talking about a whole stew of chemicals that were released in a very, very large quantity. And so I do believe that one of the things that I have proposed for the court is to think about the concept of requiring Norfolk Southern to buy out the homes and businesses of all those people who want to leave. Because if I lived there, I can tell all of you personally, if I lived in East Palestine now, I would leave. I wouldn't take any chance. Now, I recognize, and I've talked to dozens of people, that that's not possible for them. Well, let's make it possible then. Let's get the court to decide that that's got to be part of the agreement. And let's get the federal government to hold their feet to the fire instead of helping to minimize the impact on Norfolk Southern. And as far as free medical coverage, I think that ought to be a requirement. I think there is a provision for that in the settlement agreement for Norfolk Southern to pay for medical follow-ups, but it has a dollar limit, I think, of $25 million, and it has a uncertainty as to whether they would be required to renew that, or if they spend $25 million, that's the end of the health monitoring program. That health monitoring program should be mandated for citizens in the area for at least 30 years, and maybe more.
And how far out for residents, if they were able to leave, how far out would you recommend leaving, not just East Palestine, but the Western Pennsylvania area, right over the border?
Well, I'm not going to cut it off at 20 miles. Let me put it differently. The concept that the further away you are from ground zero, the lower the concentration is generally true. But there was so much released here that this poundage, 8.5 million pounds, that I don't know how far that would be. So if I had symptoms or I had concerns for me or my family, and I was 50 miles away, I would relocate if I had the means to do that. It's just not a chance worth taking, because this is serious stuff. And the other thing I'll emphasize is that they found at Time Beach that the problems weren't just with the residents, but with their children and their grandchildren. This passed through the generations because these are forever chemicals. And so, some of you people here probably have children, but think about your grandchildren too that aren't even here yet. And some of these chemicals have hormonal effects and affect the reproductive process in men and women. And if that gets passed on to the next generation, even though I've heard many people say what a wonderful place it is to live in East Palestine in particular, Darlington, I've talked to several people from there too, but you have to think long term.
So I do have another question about the homes. So a lot of the homes around this area were built around the early 1900s. And a lot of the homes have the paper insulation, horsehair plaster. Some even have asbestos siding. So if we wanted to, would it be possible to gut our homes and try to live in them chemically free? Or do you think that's not possible? Because that's been a toss-up. Some people think they can, and from the symptoms I get in my home and as quickly as I get them, I'm not very confident, and I'm afraid if I would spend the money to do something like that, would it be a waste?
You see, let me see if I can explain it more simple than it is. The answer to your question is a complex answer, but the first question is, how much is too much exposure? Now, you folks have lived in this environment now for 1.5 years. So whatever you got in your bodies is already there. And so if you moved away, it's like quitting smoking. Once you quit smoking, you eliminate the risk significantly within months and years afterwards. But And that's kind of what I'm looking at here. I can't do anything about what you've been exposed to in the last year and a half. But if you moved away, then I do know that you're not going to be exposed anymore. But that doesn't mean you won't get lung cancer. People who quit smoking still can get lung cancer years later. And that's the same thing with the chemical exposure here. And so if you are thinking of cleaning up your house, Ashley, the question is, how do you do that? If you've got your house and you put new siding on, or do you paint over it? Do you use a sealant kind of paint to try and seal any chemical residue there that you seal it in? Some of those products may have similar kinds of things you've already been exposed to, because they've all got chemicals. And so it's a question of magnitude. Is it easier to negotiate somebody buying you out and moving away to where you anticipate it would be safer? Or is it more feasible for you to put the effort in to try and clean up where you're living to the lowest level that you can as far as minimizing your future exposures? Because the longer you're exposed, the worse it can be.
See, I did ask that as a broad question because people do ask that a lot, and some have done extreme makeovers to their home for that. And I think a lot of what's not being talked about, as well as mental health. And for me to even do those things, mentally I'm going to keep thinking, am I still exposing myself? Did I bring mud into my home that's clean? Is this almost like radon? And there's so many unanswered things. So a lot of people aren't understanding. Myself, I have OCD, so I would constantly think that.
Well, the mental aspects of this is a big thing. I talk to people all the time that worry and they're anxious about it. And part of the cover-up, if you will, or where you don't have the information conveyed to you in a specific fashion, only adds to that anxiety. And so I'm sensitive to it. I hear it enough, and I think that's human nature. But in that context, actually, let's say with your OCD, you could clean up your house so that physically you may not be exposed anymore, but mentally you're still going to be exposed, not to the chemicals, but to the anxiety and to what that place represents. And so that becomes a personal decision based upon your own makeup and your own circumstances. But these are all complexities that I don't think were discussed at all in the settlement agreement.
George, can I ask you, President Biden has not issued a disaster declaration for East Palestine. It's the same thing when the Flint water crisis happened. President Obama did not issue a disaster in Flint. They claim that they can't issue disasters because legally that's only for natural disasters. Well, I argue that, but bottom line, should a disaster be declared in East Palestine, Western Pennsylvania? Because if it's declared a disaster area, obviously there's a ton more resources and federal government resources that could come in here.
I thought that there should have been a federal disaster notification within a week or two after the incident, after the derailment. If the ground rules, the law, if you will, doesn't allow it to be intervened now under recent rulings from the Supreme Court, I guess I would raise the question, is that a law or is that a regulation developed by FEMA? You know, who set the ground rules for when you can declare it a national disaster? And I suspect it's a regulation. And the Supreme Court recently ruled that the agencies have too much power to write regulations that weren't intended by Congress. And if they weren't, then those regulations don't apply. But, you know, you're a year and a half after this, and that's something that your governor and your senators and representatives should be crying to the skies about, is to get that disaster relief for you people there within some substantial distance, probably more than 20 miles by far, from the ground zero, so that it would be encompassed, and those federal funds from many different agencies would then flow to your community.
Oh, this is Kevin Detmer again. I have a question on the controlled burn. When they did that controlled burn and they blew up those 5 tanker cars, how much of that liquid that was in the rail cars have burnt, and how much of it would have gone down into the soil?
Well, there probably is no way to know that because we don't have any measured data. But what we do know is that those 5 tanker cars with vinyl chloride had about 1 million pounds total of vinyl chloride. There are about 200,000 pounds in each of those cars. And so with 5 of them, that's 1 million pounds. A large amount of it would have burned, but it also would have taken a long time so that some of it could have soaked down into the soil. And I understand from others, I haven't seen anything published, but I understand through other stories that they are still finding pockets of vinyl chloride in the community. I don't have any details about it or how much there is, but I know that's a concern, that there could be areas where that's still being retained.
And George, my last question, your toxicology opinion and just common sense opinion, should this $600 million settlement go through, or does it need to go back to the drawing board and be a lot more resources than $600 million?
Well, I wrote a 10-page document that said it should not go through. And I gave very specific science-based reasons for each phase of it that I thought should not go through. And I can say that I'm still stunned to learn today from you, Jordan, that this physician was for the plaintiffs, because his 10 questions that he responded to, I wrote detailed responses to each of his 10 questions. And I thought for certain that he was representing the defendants in this. But there is just no credibility that I've found in any element of this. Whether you're talking about measurements, procedures used, everything to me looks like there was a cover-up. And to my mind, this needs to have an independent commission, if that's the right term, but an independent body overseeing this, like maybe the National Academy of Science or something, that would look at rethinking this whole process. The one thing that was stated in the town hall meeting a week or so ago, put on by the attorneys for the plaintiffs, was they were very proud how fast this had happened. And it's been 1.5 years now that you've been exposed. I don't think speed is what you want. I think what you want is a well-considered, well-documented circumstance, and putting as much of the burden back on Norfolk Southern as possible. This is a $12 billion a year business. $600 million of this settlement agreement is going to be spread over 20 to 25 years. That's not even going to infect them at all. So there's lots of room, and I don't know that I said it before. I might have overlooked it, but a year ago in March, I proposed that they should set a $1 billion fund up to fund you people so that you could move your homes and businesses to safer places if you chose. Now, that was a year ago, and that was intended to be an initial fund. Now they're talking about 600 million spread over numerous years. So I just think it's grossly inadequate. And I'm very concerned as to why it was so important to do this quickly. And the primary motivation that I see is you've got attorneys that are going to see a third of this go into their pockets. They're going to get the biggest share of this, and it's in their benefit, as it would be in any business, to get that money in their pockets as fast as they can. But I don't see why the court should have facilitated that. The court should have looked at other opinions.
And George, one more question, sorry. There were electric cars on the train, electric cars with lithium batteries.
Yes.
There's been problems in other parts of Ohio with burning of these cars and these lithium batteries. If electric cars, I don't know the exact number, I think between 5 and 10. If electric cars with lithium batteries burned, isn't that ionization burning? And what are the health impacts of that?
Well, lithium-ion batteries and the other community is Pequot in Ohio. I'm working with them on that issue, that very issue of burning lithium-ion batteries. I just gave them a presentation yesterday on that. And I didn't know in the beginning that what was called a car rack train car had electric vehicles on it. But in looking at that, you're talking about releasing some of the most toxic chemicals, and many of you have experienced irritation, could come from that source because it releases all kinds of acidic materials, one of which is lithium fluoride, which is hydrogen fluoride, which is such a corrosive acid that it will etch glass, and it releases hydrogen chloride, which is another very corrosive chemical. So the batteries, when they burn, the chemicals that are released are very, very toxic, and you don't want to breathe those in because there are several components in the fumes of a burning lithium-ion battery that can kill you, literally, just by inhaling it. So that is a very serious component. It was only one carload, as I understand, but there's a lot of chemicals released from the batteries in those cars.
Well, George, I think you've made a lot more friends in East Palestine and Pennsylvania tonight. I'm sure they're going to be contacting you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise, and also coming out of retirement. You could be chilling on a beach, but you are spending countless hours on behalf of these residents. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.